Are we ready? All right. Good morning, everyone. I'm and welcome actually to our new venue that we haven't used in quite a little while for the Potomac Institute here. So thank you for being here. I'm Dr. Tim Welter. I'm a senior research fellow here at the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies. And thank you for joining us for the second public event of the Institute's Global Competition Project. Today's event is focused on U.S. supply chains and how they factor economically and otherwise into our nation's ability to gain and maintain competitive advantage on the global stage. This is a societal level challenge we've all experienced recently, and which a few bumps in, especially recently, and which must be understood and addressed across the public and private sectors together if we are to expect sustainable access to the services and materials vital to our future prosperity and security. While today we're going to be using the state of U.S. microelectronics supply chain as a vehicle to help guide our discussion, this is a multifaceted, complex issue tied closely to our nation's competitive posture. So the hope is today to unwrap some of that and understand the issue better. But before we get into today's discussion, I'd like to offer the floor to the chairman of the Potomac Institute, General Al Gray, for his comments.
Well, welcome everybody. And of course, we're delighted to have yet another symposium on this very, very important topic of the supply chain, microelectronics, and related activities. We're especially fortunate to have some distinguished speakers here today. And we deeply appreciate you all showing up, and I assume you're going to give them a proper introduction.
Yes, sir.
One of them, of course, Dr. McGlone, he's on TV, but that's the handsome man in the picture right now. And so without any further ado, we'll get going. We've got a lot to talk about, and more importantly, about the fifth topic.
Thank you, General Gray. And now I'd like to offer the floor to our CEO, Dr. Jennifer Buss, for a few comments.
Good morning. Thanks everyone for joining us today. As many of you know, the topic of supply chain security and microelectronics has been near and dear to the Potomac Institute for over half of the Institute's lifetime, over 15 years. We're pleased to have Dr. Fritze, a senior fellow and VP here at Potomac Institute, as a distinguished speaker today as part of the panel, and I will let Tim do the rest of the introductions appropriately. But as General Gray said, we have a lot to talk about, a lot to think about, and thank you all today for joining us.
Thank you, Dr. Buss. So before we introduce our panel members, a little bit about the Global Competition Project, just to kind of kick us off and frame what we're doing here today. So the project was launched to explore what the United States must do to continue to thrive as a global leader, economically and otherwise, driving toward a societal level understanding and approach to competition at the intersection of policy, industry, and science, where the Potomac Institute is focused on over its history. So to do so, the project is commissioning a spectrum of experts from diverse fields across Potomac Institute's network. Their purpose is to highlight and elevate issues surrounding both the challenges and opportunities associated with societal level competition today and in the future. What are the greatest vulnerabilities to consider? What is at stake? How do we best leverage our strengths as a country and with our partners, for that matter? Ultimately, the project's goal is to develop foundational references and discussions like this through research, papers, et cetera, for national security professionals, for policymakers and industry leaders, and others as they drive awareness and understanding and how the U.S. might address the most consequential aspects of near-peer competition. So without further ado, I'll introduce our distinguished panel. First of all, to my left, I'm happy to introduce Dr. Mike Fritze, Vice President here at the Potomac Institute. where he oversees the microelectronics portfolio and is director of the VITAL Center, which stands for the Vital Infrastructure Technology and Logistics Center. Mike has a distinguished career across academia, the government, and working with industry to include stints with USC, MIT Lincoln Labs, DARPA, and NDIA, to name a few. Appropriately, Dr. Fritze today will facilitate our discussion on U.S. supply chain fragility. We are also joined today by our other distinguished panelists. I'll start at the far end of the table. The Honorable Al Shaffer is with us today, who's also a member of our Board of Regents here at Potomac Institute, and former Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisitions and Sustainment. And that's just one of several distinguished postings he's held over at the Department of Defense, at NATO, and that's all after retiring as a colonel from the U.S. Air Force. Dr. Jay Lewis, also joining us today, is a partner for Silicon Projects at Microsoft. In this role, he leads strategic projects focused on the future of hardware supply chain, including access, assurance, and integrity. Dr. Lewis also previously worked at DARPA, so we got a few DARPA graduates here. Was a program manager for RTI International, and also had a temporary appointment supporting the Army Research Office in the relationships with universities and business and small businesses. So again, that intersection, science, business, and government working in academia, working together. And then definitely last but not least, virtually joining us today is Mr. Mike McGlone. He's a senior commodity strategist for Bloomberg Intelligence, a unique research platform that provides context on industries, companies, and government policy. Mr. McGlone specializes in the broad investable commodity and crypto markets. So really interested to get that angle and aspect of things today moving forward. So Dr. Fritze will start today's discussion by providing a deeper introduction of the issue and a framework for our discussion that will ultimately be captured along with highlights from today's event in a paper. That's just one paper in a series that's going to be produced by the project. That's the vision for it, again, to provide those tools for policymakers, industry, and other leaders focused on this area. So the goal is for those papers, along with the substance of today's event, to be drawn upon as a reference, again, for policymakers, industry leaders, and others, and how this country might address the most consequential aspects of societal level competition in the future. So that said, Dr. Fritze, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Tim, very much for that kind introduction. And I'm excited actually to moderate this event on a really timely and very important topic for the country. It's something that, as Dr. Buss mentioned, that Potomac has been thinking about for quite some time, and had the pleasure to be working on this for quite some time. So I'm going to make a few off-the-cuff remarks to hopefully set the stage on where we're going here. First off, to focus everybody, so who has tried to buy a car recently or done any renovation work around their home, right, or anything else that involves supply chain? It's not very pleasant, right, what's going on today. So sure, that's a short time response to the COVID crisis, but it is indicative of a broader supply chain issue that we're facing that sort of was under the hood and people didn't really pay enough attention to, especially in the microelectronic space, which is the focus of today's conversation. So although I'm a strong believer that this is a temporary disruption that we're suffering from due to the COVID pandemic, it still has laid bare supply chain issues in the electronics space that we as an institute and other people thinking about this problem have been concerned about for quite some time. And that has to be the globalization of this field and the vulnerable points, the vulnerable touch points in the sensitive supply chain that we have. So I wanted to point out that semiconductors and microelectronics are a broad global industry. Pretty much the United States government began all the efforts in this area back when the technology was first developed. A bunch of Nobel Prizes were awarded, mostly to U.S. people in the 50s and 60s. So I would say sort of 60s and 70s was the beginning of this field. and the government was the dominant customer. A lot of the technology was defense oriented for the Cold War. We built radar systems, we built digital computing. I remember when I was at Lincoln Laboratory, they had little museum pieces of some of the first tube digital computers standing there. And I was wondering, what are they doing in a defense place with tube digital computers? Well, they were analyzing the radar signals, right, for Russian bombers, basically, at the time. So the point is, this entire industry was developed by the US defense enterprise. Interestingly enough, it became so successful that the commercial spin-offs from all of these technologies that the government was the early investor on became dominant. And now we're in a situation where somewhat about 1% or perhaps less than 1% of the market is due to US defense. So this is a very different space that we're playing in now than we were used to playing in decades ago when the US government dominated this field and actually, frankly, helped create this field. So this is actually very, very important. So what does the space look like now, right? It means commercial. It means people have globalized the locations of the various steps of the supply chain. We all know that in recent years, fabrication and testing, for example, in this space has moved heavily to Asia. Basically, the forces of capitalism move things to where they're done the cheapest way. We do just-in-time sourcing. We don't like to have a big stock of unsold inventory. All of that stuff is optimized according to capitalism, and it leads to a situation that works very well and is very cost-optimized in normal times. However, when you start to have a crisis, and that may be a pandemic, it could be a geopolitical crisis, with a potential adversary, it could be a natural disaster, things don't respond very well when they're optimized in that manner. And this is what we're facing in the COVID crisis, for example. So what can we take from this? Well, what we can take by the increased focus on the supply chain is where are our vulnerable points. One of the things that our speakers, I think, will mention today is how dependent we are on key steps of the supply chain in microelectronics on overseas sources. I would say in fabrication, probably 70%, if not in excess. If you're talking about advanced foundry, it's probably even larger. For advanced foundry percentage is coming from Asia, from geopolitically contested areas or geopolitically risky areas in Asia. That's not an optimum situation for the long term for the United States. Very similar for packaging and testing. If anything, the ratio is even larger. I would say in the 90s of advanced packaging and testing for chips is done in Asia. And so this is something we need to be cognizant of because COVID has driven home the point that it is possible to get cut off from critical supplies that the United States relies on. That is a problem for the defense and national security. It is also a huge problem for industry and commercial prosperity. So I wanted to sort of close my opening remarks with the whole national prosperity issue. I'm a child of the Cold War, so I lived through the competition with the Soviets on tanks and aircraft and technology and all these kinds of things. What was interesting is that eventually the economics proved fatal to the Soviet Union. The US not only had a strong defense enterprise, but it also had a very, very strong commercial technology base. And that basically crushed the Soviet Union in terms of economic power. There's a lesson to be learned from that. And I think today's adversaries are determined to not be able to not be crushed economically like the Soviets were in the 90s. And because of that, we're now facing a non-kinetic kind of competition environment based in the economic realm, heavily in the economic realm. So this is a new game that we're playing. And one of the things I think the Global Competition Project is working on is how do we play this game? How do we play this new game of global competition when we're now competing non-kinetically and financially and economically with other powers on the earth? And we also have very different value systems, for example. So this is an entirely new game than when I grew up in the Cold War. And I think this project here is extremely important to try to set some ground rules and to do some thinking about how we play in this new game of economic competition, because it's happening every day and people will fill in the details. So with that, hopefully I've set the stage a bit on where we are in microelectronics and the role of global economic competition in keeping the United States very healthy in the space. One other final remark is that I like to think of military as in two bins. The offensive players is the economy. So the strength of your offense is how strong your economy is and how much money you're able to spend on defense. Your defense is kinetic. So if you're going kinetic, you've probably already failed. It means your offense is not strong enough. So I think a lot of the global competition project is going to be based on how do we do a better offense in the era of economic competition. So with that, hopefully I've set some of the base goals of this session here, and I will turn the microphone over to the Honorable Al Shaffer for a couple of opening remarks on the supply chain and microelectronics from his extensive experience in senior government positions. No, and really impressive, I have to say. So we have an impressive panel here. I'm excited to hear what everyone has to say.
Thank you, Mike. And thank you, Potomac, for holding this. It's tremendous. I think something we have to think about very seriously as a nation. I'd like to react and change what I was going to say, react to a couple of things that you said, Mike. First, you said that the market and the forces of capitalism goes to the cheapest. And that is true. But we're in a playing field where other nations are heavily subsidizing microelectronics, and the U.S. is not. Korea has announced a $450 billion government investment in their commercial entities over the next 10 years. China has said that they're going to invest about 200 to 250 billion, and Taiwan is also doing a similar investment. That makes it very hard without the U.S. government involvement for U.S. entities to be competitive. But I don't think we have a choice as a nation. I will go back to something that General Mattis said as he was looking at the last nuclear posture review, and someone asked him about the cost of it. And General Mattis said something to the effect of, you can't spend too much when national security is at risk. And I honestly believe in microelectronics, national security is at risk. And national security in this case is economic, but also all of our critical infrastructure. And you did have the fact absolutely right. The DoD is about 1% of the global market. But the thing in front of America is, how do we incentivize domestic production of microelectronics? Now, how do we incentivize domestic production of microelectronics in an era where we are very reliant on microelectronics? And I've heard people say that data is the new oil. So you got to hang with me on this one. I am also a product of the Cold War, but I'm also a product of the early 70s OPEC crisis. The oil Organization of Petroleum and Export Countries controlled about 1/3 of the world market in oil. U.S. could produce 67% of what we needed. And yet when OPEC cut us off, our economy went into a fairly severe recession. Contrast that to where we are in microelectronics. The U.S. uses about 48% of the world's supply of microelectronics and finished products. We produce about 12%. So during OPEC, we produced 2/3 of what we need. Now we produce about 25% of what we need. If we don't recognize that the economic engine and data is the new oil and data runs on microelectronics, we're going to continue to have problems from a national security perspective and a competitive perspective. So I don't think that there's any real choice but to actually have some type of combined government-public partnership to incentivize industry to produce domestically. And we can do that a number of ways. One would be a policy perspective that we don't talk about just DoD for national security, but you include the power grid, the air traffic control grid, the energy distribution grid, the health sector, and finance. And when you put all of those together, that comes to between 20 and 25% of the world demand. All of a sudden, we have a domestic demand for chips made with confidentiality and integrity that could be made in the U.S. to provide greater security and provide a market that would give us the domestic capacity that we need. So it's not just a policy thing to create a larger definition of demand. I think we have to think about how do we spend money differently. I mentioned the amount of money that China, Korea, and Taiwan are putting into microelectronics. By contrast, our government has the United States Innovation and Competitive Act, USICA, which is promising $52 billion over the next 5 to 10 years. That 52 against 250 doesn't work. But if we go ahead and pull some of the levers of the government that we have allowed in the past, allowing industry to have things like below prime rate interest rates, guaranteed loans, you can get an enormous amount of leverage. Government doesn't do that very well. Industry does that well. So I think that we have to look at a different model where it's not government trying to run a large investment from China, from Congress to our industry, but we have to think about how do we create some type of public-private partnership for a sustainable model that will allow us to not just use direct investment, but leverage from grants and loans to give you more of a working capital. And the final thing I will say is that I think that we do need to have a very serious discussion with industry. I saw a chart yesterday for the first time, and I'm going to try to get it so that it can be released. It came from Bloomberg. It showed the difference in investment and spend of two of the largest semiconductor companies in Asia. I'm not going to say which ones, and two of the largest ones in the US. Asian companies are reinvesting in capitalization and research and development. American companies are investing in shareholder payback. And that is a problem if we're going to look at this as a strategic initiative. If we continue to only worry in America about paying off the shareholders and not having a strategic, sustainable market, we're going to continue to struggle. So to sum it up, I think we have to look at this problem differently. It's clearly a national security issue. I think we have to think about expanding the definition of what we have to have as secure. I think we have to think about a different model for investment that includes not just direct grants, but other levers of capital. And then we have to work with industry to think that this is going to be a strategic partnership between government and industry so that we start to have not just interest in share owner payback, but sustainability. And in such a way, we can build a domestic capacity, I believe, that will allow the U.S. to be competitive. So I kind of deviated from where I was going based upon your comments. I hope that's okay.
Absolutely okay. It's a thinking goal here.
Yep.
Our goal is to think about this problem. So thank you very much, Al. I really appreciate those perspectives. I think we're going to go through the speakers, right? Questions are for later.
Questions are for, and actually, thank you for bringing that up because after each of the speakers or panelists provide some comments, we will have a Q&A session to continue the discussion to include those that are joining us virtually. So
okay.
I'll get those via chat and we'll share them as they come across.
Yeah, so thank you for that. So people know the protocol of how to engage, right? It's supposed to be an interactive event here, so good. So we'll move on and we'll go through the speaker's remarks, and I have the pleasure to give the microphone to Jay Lewis. I was going to say, Colin, I don't know if we overlapped at DARPA. We probably didn't overlap at DARPA, but we certainly share a passion for the DARPA philosophy of placing large bets on risky ideas, that some of which pan out. So Jay has long experience helping manage the MTO office at DARPA, especially the hardware security portfolio, and is now working at Microsoft. I'm sorry if I'm repeating the bio, but since I know Jay, I wanted to say a few things about some of our intersections in career interests. So Jay, you have the floor to talk about the supply chain in semis and Microsoft perspective.
Sounds good. Thank you for the kind introduction, and thanks to the Potomac Institute as well for the chance to be here today. We're an important topic and one that is very near and dear to my heart. I thought I would spend just a minute introducing sort of my journey from DARPA and the DoD. I think we were a near miss in our time there.
Just missed it. Yeah.
Yeah. My journey from there to Microsoft, because it actually directly relates to the topic today. Of all the interesting things happening at DARPA at the time, and it's a just wonderful place to spend some of your career. The thing that kept me up at night was the microelectronics challenge and the challenges that we were facing. I used to say the DoD is spending 99% of their time worrying about 1% of their chips. And what I meant by that was, there was sort of an assumption that everything commercial would be fine and would take care of itself. And it makes complete sense to worry a lot about that 1% of the chips, the chips that are designed by the DoD and for the DoD, because if they don't, nobody else is going to take care of that problem. But the other 99%, those commercial chips, were not really seen as a national security problem. It is encouraging to see how much the dialogue has changed since then. So really, when my time to lead DARPA came, I learned that Microsoft in particular was paying very much attention to this issue, and I was very encouraged to see, from my perspective, how there was increasing alignment between the perspectives of people in the government and people in commercial industry. Particularly with respect to supply chain issues, and particularly the resiliency and the integrity of the supply chain. It is something that certainly as hyperscale cloud companies like Microsoft and others, are really sort of becoming critical infrastructure. The security of those systems is something that is always top of mind. There, after what had seemed like a couple of decades of sort of drifting apart between defense, which to Mike's earlier point used to be intimately integrated with the electronics industry, was sort of drifting further and further, and those relationships were sort of getting weaker. That was starting to change, and so one of the things that I've had the chance to do with Microsoft is to look at some of these very specific issues. And as I mentioned, the resiliency of the supply chain, so making sure that chips are available when they're needed, and the integrity and security of the supply chain, both of which are challenging problems. We have a long way to go, but I think I agree with the rest of the panel that we can do better by working together on some of these issues. One of the things that I would highlight, I think a lot of people understand this, but just to make sure, I think it's worth just a brief mention. Some of the differences between some of the supply chain issues that we're seeing today, for example, in the auto industry, and the thing that everybody sort of notices, like, oh, I'm maybe not going to make as many iPhones next year as I thought, and some of the things that you have to be worried about from a national security and economic security perspective. The way I think about these two things is sort of supply chain disruptions, supply chain anomalies, where supply is not quite keeping up with demand. And certainly I think part of the education of the country and some of our policymakers, has really been to see what the downstream impacts of that will be. And we're not shipping as many cars as we used to. So this pretty inexpensive component is holding up an entire industry. But there are other bigger challenges, and I think both of the other panelists have mentioned some of the concerns, for example, with Taiwan in particular, TSMC in particular, the sort of black swan event that that keeps you up at night. When you think about what might happen if supply chains were dramatically broken, particularly when there were critical components. And it's important to keep in mind that these are not, necessarily just the big, expensive, high-powered chips, but the number of chips that go into any complex system are very diverse, come from different places in the world, different companies, different process technologies. And so, just simply saying that we're going to make things more secure by, having a particular foundry in the U.S., it's certainly a good step forward, but it doesn't solve that problem. But a lot of the supply chain disruptions that we're seeing today are frankly in older technologies. And so, if you look at the global manufacturing capacity over time, some people sort of assume that a new technology node comes out, and then eventually that gets replaced by a newer one, and then that gets replaced by a newer one. And it's actually not true at all. Most of these technologies have essentially a steady state. There's a certain capacity that still exists from technologies that are more than 20 years old. And what was new more recently is an increase in demand for some of these older technologies. And so the industry doesn't really have a good model for how to invest in older technologies, where, paying for a new fab essentially prices you out of the market. And really the only way that that's been done that I'm aware of has been through very heavy government subsidies. And so, one of the things that we need to talk about and understand, both from an industry perspective and government and policymaking perspective, is where to focus the investment. You can focus on some of these sort of current supply chain problems. How many cars are we going to ship? That's a real economic impact. Versus thinking about true technology leadership and thinking about where the industry is going to go, where sort of manufacturing expertise and capability is going to go sort of in the future, the 5 to 10 to 20 year future. And is that really the better place to invest? And so it's I think just something to keep in mind when we talk about supply chains, that there are the solutions to short-term problems are quite different than the prescriptions for how you would solve some of the longer-term and more strategic problems. So with that, certainly plenty of other things I'm sure we'll get into, but
I appreciate that, Jay. I can't help but make a quick comment on the end, and I alluded to that in my opening remarks. And there's a lot of focus on a short-term solution for our current supply chain issue, which was this pandemic-driven, which I believe is mostly a fear response to the pandemic. That is different from the long-term systemic things that you're talking about and that Al spoke about, right? And so I'm glad there's attention on this. But it's a lot more than just the short-term supply shortage. This is much more than that. There's a lot more at stake here than just solving this immediate supply chain issue that we're facing now. So thank you, Jay, for mentioning that. So moving forward, we'll move to our next speaker on our panel, Mr. Mike McGlone. He's a senior commodity strategist at Bloomberg Intelligence, and he's going to give us the financial perspective on the supply chain issues here facing the semiconductor industry in the United States. So, Michael, take it away.
Well, thank you, Dr. Fritze. I want to focus initially on what you said about economics proved fail to the Soviet Union. I'll lay out a
sound check. Sound. We'll fix it, Mike.
How about now? Can
Either
you hear me?
someone's on mute or someone's on not here.
Hi, just for the record, everyone online can hear him. We just came.
Oh, well, that's good.
Okay.
That's good.
Can you hear me now? Hello. Can you hear me now? Hello, testing. Can you hear me now?
We're working on it, Michael. We can't hear you locally.
Okay.
But bear with us, folks, for a moment.
They're probably Chinese chips.
So just a reminder, we'll be answering Q&A from here in the room, but then also online. So just go ahead and provide those. We've already had a couple come in.
Good.
To discuss. And I'm really interested once we get the sound working to hear what Mr. McGlone has to say, especially given his focus and expertise in crypto and how that cryptocurrencies and how that impacts where we're at today with our supply chain issues and where it's going really at the end of the day, since that's seen by many as the future of finance and how we interact, right, financially across the globe. So I'm really lucky to have him. So
it's good to set the stage.
Yeah. One of the things that didn't come out in either of any of our first three talks was how the nature of the industry has gone to basically a single supplier for a class of chips. I mean, that's what really drove the automotive problem. The fact that TSMC dominated that 45 NAND module, everybody else got out, so we're a single point of failure. They decided to exit because they didn't have the orders coming in, and we didn't have any competitive supply chains.
There's no slack. Well, it's a sign of the maturing of an industry, right?
Maybe we have to go back to adolescence.
But it's fascinating. Now, it's a fascinating discussion because this is what happens when industries mature, right? You go down to like one or two suppliers,
right? Two I can live with. One's a problem.
One is a concern. And another thing that I hope we come back to is, Alan, you mentioned, sort of the confidentiality and integrity of things.
Yep.
And that's very much a concern, certainly from an industrial perspective as well. How do you do that? Just putting things in the U.S., I'd argue doesn't achieve that goal. So actually, what do we do?
There are other things you have to do.
Yeah. So I would comment those are two, and we'll fill up the time here. That's fine. There are two imperatives here, right? One is, you're right, the security, confidentiality, and integrity, and DARPA has led the way in a lot of the programs. But the other one is just raw access. And I think that motivated Al's comments in the beginning.
Yes.
If you're cut off from any access, the security doesn't matter because you can't get your chips at all. Mm-hmm. So there's two concerns. Obviously, if you have something domestic, you're less likely to be cut off in a crisis. That doesn't mean you've met all your security objectives.
Yeah. I believe in defense in depth, and it's not just a trusted foundry, and it's not just quantitative assurance, but it's having both. And having provenance over the people who have access to designs and masks and things for domestic national security issues. And for that, we should be willing to pay a little bit more for it. I mean, I'd be willing to pay a little bit extra on my electric bill if I knew that the network wasn't fragile because it was using chips that we didn't understand the provenance of.
That's something I'd love to drill down a little bit more with the whole panel, right? Mm-hmm. On Al's suggestion is there actually a business opportunity? Is there a market? Is there an emerging market, right, in the higher security types of devices? Is that the case, and how might the government?
Yeah, we would never know if they tacked it onto our electric bill. I can never follow how it goes up.
Jeez. So, Mike, it looks like we might have a fix that'll work.
Hello, can you hear me?
Do you want to go ahead and try Mike now?
Test 1, 2. Can you hear me?
All right.
Oh, sweet.
We got
oh boy. There we go. Okay.
Then we have oxygen.
There we go. Thank you, sir, for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation. I think that the way to start is to piggybacking off of what you've said, most notably what Dr. Fritze said about economics proved failed to the Soviet Union. That's what's happening right now in commodities and cryptos. The U.S. is crushing China in cryptocurrencies and commodities. And that's a fact, and I'll point that out. So the rule I have in Bloomberg intelligence we have is facts first, then explain. So there's the facts. What I do here is I publish for the terminal. I publish my views. I have an editor. As you would tell me at the end of my conversation, from the south side of Chicago, we say the Bears, not the Bears. But I do dig in, and I point out some significant trends are happening in this space that are very significant to the defense and the economics in this country. And it starts with cryptocurrencies. I'll start with the first fact of crypto assets. The most widely traded crypto assets on the planet are crypto dollars. It's not Bitcoin. It's not Ethereum. Crypto dollars. And that's happened organically, globally, on a global basis. And a lot of it's from Asia. A lot of it's from Chinese citizens. And this is from my connections. I'm a global firm of people in China. That is a main reason why China is trying to launch a central bank digital currency. They're trying to catch up. and that they banned crypto assets. So let's look at the facts of 2021. China has completely banned its citizens from having access to crypto assets other than Chinese. At the same time, US, Europe, and Canada are embracing it with regulation and moving forward with ETFs and futures. To me, that's the beginning of a Cold War. So I want to have you picture this. Imagine 1.3 billion people, how they're going to feel in a year or two from now as crypto assets just continue to advance on a global scale, and they're not allowed to participate. That's what's happening. And it's a significant development. To me, it's the most important thing that I want to address in terms of technology. The U.S. is crushing it by its system and by just accepting the technology and adapting and hopefully throwing some good regulation in. So I'll end with not end, but I want to keep remember is Bitcoin is not hurting the U.S. dollar. It's accelerating the value and the dominance of the U.S. dollar on a global scale. Dollar, the most widely traded crypto asset is Tether. It's a crypto dollar. And remember, how did euro dollars start? Euro dollars are just US dollars that trade in European banks. They started after World War II when the Soviet Union needed access to dollars. They couldn't do it in the US. This is what's happening globally. Everybody wants dollars. They want to do it digitally. It's just a better way to go. So to me, it's the key thing to think about what's happening in crypto assets. And it's the main thing I want to mention for this panel is it's for the U.S. not to mess up. So the way I look at it is when you're in the middle of a battle and you're crushing your enemy, what do you have to worry about? That's first of all, continue what you're doing, what your enemy is going to do to try to adjust. So far, the situation is if the U.S. just has proper regulation, which is going towards crypto dollars, the world is coming our way. And I see what's happening recently is potentially the first signs of the beginning of the decline of the Chinese Communist Party. And these are facts based on the data I see in the Bloomberg terminal. Their GDP is in incremental decline. They just cut their triple R rate. That's the required reserve rate. Every time they cut the reserve rate, it's a signal that ignore what they say, watch what they do. That's a problem. Their economy's having problems. They're having problems with property companies. That's fully expected. Some of us predicted this for years. It's just starting to kick in. So that's what's happening with China. In the U.S., what are we doing? All we have to do is do nothing, and the world's come to this asset. So I can slow down on cryptocurrencies and transition a little over commodities, but I need to make that key point and make sure it's known well. When people say the dollar is potentially being replaced by Bitcoin, it's the opposite. Bitcoin is becoming global collateral, the digital reserve asset. It's replacing gold. And who's the biggest gold miner on the planet? China. And then there's crypto dollars. They are accelerating their dominance as far as being the global reserve asset. That's happening organically. So I want to transition over a little commodities a little bit. We mentioned some of us who are children of the Cold War. Remember 1979 when the price of gas went above a gallon? I was a gas jockey because of the issues with Iran hostages. And back then, the U.S. is one of the biggest importers of crude oil on the planet. And until 2010, we still were the biggest crude oil importer on the planet. As of 2019, the U.S. is an exporter because of what? Rapidly advancing technology. And that's only accelerating. I own the farm in the Midwest. 40% of our U.S. corn crop now is used for ethanol production. The rest of the world envies that. How has that happened? That was a government program, but it's helped support the price of corn. Without that, price would have collapsed. It's helping U.S. farmers. So the key factor to remember about commodities is number one, the U.S. is the largest producer and now exporter of energy, natural gas, electricity, crude oil, liquid fuels, I like to say, because you got to add ethanol in there. We have a major production of ethanol. 15% of our total gasoline production is now U.S. ethanol. So in energy and production, we're crushing it. And then there's agriculture, Corn Belt, you sow on a farm. The U.S. is the largest producer and exporter of agriculture products in the world. Think of corn and soybeans. Everything else trickles down from there in terms of commodities. Number one, most widely produced significant commodity on the planet in terms of dollar value of metric production is corn. And where is that produced? Most vast majority is in the I states, Illinois, Iowa, and Indiana. I had my farm in Indiana. So to me, that's a key thing to think about when we're thinking about U.S. defense. Economically, the U.S. is crushing it in crypto assets. It's becoming I'm in Miami because it's a job creation machine in this country. The whole business has left China. And where has it gone? U.S. and Canada, most notably. That's the miners. So from an economic standpoint, the way I look at it, and the way I'd like to leave it with the panel is, and for the audience, is this is for the U.S. to embrace with proper regulation, embrace in technology, or risk falling behind. And that's what China's doing right now. They're falling behind in cryptos and commodities. They're one of the biggest importers of crude oil now. I'll leave it with you and pass it back to you.
Right. Well, thank you, Mike, very much. There's a little bit of echoes bothering me a little. Sorry about that. Thank you very much for those comments, and I appreciate that it's not all gloom and doom. We hear a lot about gloom and doom with competition, right, with China these days, and you're giving some positive statistics here and positive areas. I'd like to add to that a little bit from my career in semis and following this very closely. I know China has made huge investments in fabrication, for example, but the fact of the matter is, I'm sort of piling on to some of Mike's comments, they haven't been very effective in terms of weaning the Chinese off of dependence on the West for microchips. Mm-hmm. They are still intensely dependent on the West for microchips. The vast majority of their modern chips come from the West. They're not really close in replacing things like TSMC or Samsung or even what Intel's able to do. And so one might argue that those investments haven't been very successful. I'm frankly a lot more concerned about design competition, using overseas fabs, for example, as being a threat from China rather than fabrication, which we hear a lot about. So I just wanted to pile on top of Mike's comments that it isn't all gloom and doom with China. We are doing very well in many aspects, but we need to keep doing well, and we need to keep playing a good offense in a changing game. So I had to pile. Sorry about that, Mike, but I had to pile a little bit on top of some of your comments about what we have in our corner. So I know we have questions, but I'm sort of taking the moderator's prerogative to be able to start the conversation, and then we'll move on to questions from the audience. One of the things that I would really like, especially Jay and Mike, to provide some input on is some of Al's comments on the future of a secure electronics market, right? We're now looking at not only the Defense Department, but critical infrastructure industries, banking, automotive, perhaps pharma, perhaps healthcare, other areas that are part of very important infrastructure. Is there a sustainable market there for secure electronics that would command a higher premium? I know Jay mentioned, right, having older technologies doesn't give you the premium. So you don't have the incentive for building a fab, for example. Well, perhaps there might be a premium if there's a new market where people are willing to pay more. So I wanted particularly feedback from Jay and from Mike on whether they think there is such a market for more secure devices that Al has proposed.
I could maybe start with a few comments. One is, I think that that is already being built. We are already paying more for the added security that's being put into chips today by all the biggest chip makers. Intel and AMD are two of the obvious ones. So security, and the number of security engineers that are put to work designing chips today, I think would surprise a lot of people who aren't sort of closer to that. So to some degree, I think it's happening. The main thing that I think is important from my perspective is to understand that I don't think that there is a way to build sort of a US only secure supply chain. That any complex system is going to require global technology, parts that come from all over the place, parts that are assembled all over the place. And if you try to get away from that, you're going to become less competitive and actually start to hurt the challenges and the advantages that we have today. So it needs to be global. Again, for any sort of advanced complex system. So to me, the right conversation is how do we improve security across the board, across the industry, across the dozens of suppliers that touch chips from sort of conception IP blocks through assembly and delivery of complete systems. How do we sort of raise all boats? and I think there are good models for doing that. We've, made great progress on cybersecurity and software and things like that. So how do you apply some of those principles to hardware? Because, in that case, I think at the end of the day, there is a market for it to some degree. You are anybody who's using, Microsoft products, you are subsidizing many thousands of security engineers and security professionals. So we do that today. It's how do we sort of apply that to what's sort of been, I don't want to say a blind spot, but a part of these systems that still need some work, which is some of the hardware supply chains.
So one quick comment, I'll let Al make a few responses to that. Is I wouldn't disagree that it's going to be international. A supply chain is going to be international. But I think what we're talking about here is a market that may incentivize international players to work on higher security, right? Whereas today, or at least in the past, it hasn't been a priority. Performance and price have been the priorities. Mm-hmm. So I'm not saying that all domestic is necessarily the goal, but having a more secure parts that cost more, for example, because of the security is, I think, what we're talking about. But I'll let Al make a few remarks.
So, in an ideal world, I would say domestic, but you have to expand domestic to friends and allies. I have heard people in this industry say that it is not possible to have a domestic foundry. Until we have a way of understanding the integrity of the chips that go into our national security infrastructure, I will remind folks that with the current trusted supplier model the U.S. uses, to date, I don't believe there's been one compromise from a trusted supplier. So we have something that works. We can use advanced models to start to understand the integrity of future chips. But this cuts across all nodes, cuts across state of the art, state of the present, and legacy. And, I hear that, so yeah, we had a good way of protecting our software until Russian hackers get into the Colonial Pipeline and cause disruption in the US. And they just wanted the Bitcoin payoff. Suppose that had been a state actor who didn't do it for a small Bitcoin payoff, but did it to truly disrupt U.S. strategic ability to respond to things. So I really think that understanding the integrity, even more so than the confidentiality, but understanding the integrity of microelectronics that go into our national security infrastructure is very important. Because without that, and I know it's a global supply chain. I also know that some countries that I won't name the name of that begins with CH are pretty good at putting things like Trojan horses and backdoors in their chips. I don't feel real good about thinking that another country has the ability to control whether or not we provide electricity to our people. So I'll just leave it at that. It's not a simple one size fits all. But, I grew up and I've been in security for 45 years. Until I know that we have a secure alternative, I want to go with what we know works, even if we have to pay a premium.
Well, there's two, and I have to make one more comment before turning it over to Mike, and that's there's actually two objectives, right? One is, can you have a relationship with a secure supplier? Number one. And number two is, can you test your way to security?
Right.
And number two is what and I was involved in some of the early DARPA trust work. Mm-hmm. That is an ongoing, intense research field, but I don't think we have a comprehensive answer yet for number two. And lacking number two, we have to pursue number one. And, that may involve some international partners, but we have to continue to pursue relationships with people that we trust because we don't have number two ready yet.
Yeah. Hopefully that's what I said.
No, I'm rephrasing. I'm paraphrasing your comments.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, I'll jump in. This is what makes panels fun because I disagree.
Okay, cool. Cool.
Yeah, I guess my concern, I agree that number two isn't ready yet. The concern I have, and again, sort of the keep me up at night problem was number one doesn't work either. So we've done the Trusted Foundry program, and I would also argue that we've shown that it doesn't work. it's a temporary solution. And so it is not a sustainable solution into the future. A trusted foundry in the US doesn't solve the problem because there are too many technologies, too many process nodes, too many different products that go into, again, a complex system. So, I do think that we need to start thinking about workable solutions. And I don't mean to dismiss that, there are good security practices to learn from, for example, the Trusted Foundry program. But, I don't think that that is a model that actually we have today that works either. And frankly, there are only two leading edge companies today that are third-party foundries. Intel hopes to be in the future. And those are both non-US companies. And so even if you were to do it today, I don't know, how you would accomplish that.
So please
go ahead. We all have thoughts on this.
I do want to, and just come back and say, one thing I don't want to have happen is have this discussion devolve around an urban myth that the trusted supplier model has not worked. To me, to date, we have not had one compromise from a trusted supplier. Now, maybe there needs to be scaling, there needs to be tweaks, it needs to be modified. But to say the trusted model doesn't work, I think I can't subscribe to that.
I just mean I can't buy a leading edge chip today from that program.
That's
that's
fair.
That the security is there's the security of it is I agree with you.
I agree 100%. But if we recognize that 70% of the chips that we use are not, or 80% are not state of the art, I want to be protected for that 80%.
Yeah, let me make a comment before giving the microphone to Mike, because I definitely want to hear what Mike has to say on this issue. But so I think we're talking really about two approaches, right? Just to go back to the original comments that Al made. One is it's important to have relationships with foundry folks that are your allies or domestic, right? And so to me, the whole trusted foundry kind of approach means a relationship between particular foundries. Second, it's also important to be able to test totally unknown parts and find out what you can from them. And those are two different things. That's what we're talking about here. But we could talk about this for the rest of this one issue for the rest of this session.
Don't forget what President Reagan said. Trust but verify.
Trust but verify. Well, that's why we're talking. Mm-hmm. That's why DARPA originally in 2006 got very heavily involved in developing technologies to verify. And they're still doing it. They're still doing it. So, Mike, I didn't want to leave you out of this discussion. So do you believe that there is an emerging market for secure electronics that would incentivize companies to be able to get a higher margin on secure electronics, for example?
My main connection is what Mr. Shaffer said. It's the payment of ransom to maybe support these attacks or to support terrorists and things. And using Bitcoin is the absolute worst way to do that, because feds can track it. There's a transaction, there's a ledger. Every time you use a credit card, same thing. So that's the key thing to think about from a cryptocurrency standpoint. There's this entity called the Silk Road, which was illegal. Feds caught them. This was like 2013, 14, nailed them by just tracking the transaction. Oh, sorry. Looks like we got a little bit of background there. But that's the key thing to think about in terms of the whole world's going digital. All transactions are going digital, going crypto assets. And if bad entities are trying to use payment forms, the worst thing they can do is do Bitcoin. They'll get caught. And that's what happened with Colonial Pipeline. They got all that Bitcoin back. What they have to use is some kind of privacy coin or something that are not as significant. And the federal, I fully expect our government should be on top of those. And that to me is the key thing that's ideal about the old days of cash. Everything that's digital is trackable.
It's an important distinction, Mike. Thank you for keeping us honest about that distinction, right, between the anonymity of cash versus digital.
Well, that's the thing about Bitcoin. Like Colonial Pipeline's example, they got them.
Mike, and it amplifies a little bit of what the point I was trying to make. We had a tremendous vulnerability from Colonial Pipeline from basically a group of criminal hackers. To me, the most important thing from that event was how easy and how fragile our current national security structure is, not what they used for the payoff. So if that had been a state actor who didn't care about getting money back, but just wanted to shut down our fuel distribution grid, it may not have come back online very quickly. And that's the bigger concern for me.
That's the first question I want to ask the panel. That was my first reaction, was the fact that this happened was very good for the security of the United States, because it wasn't the state. It might have been, but now we're prepared. Thank you very much for warning us where it's going. It's like we all mentioned, the whole world is going to an economic battlefield. And because this happened, we're aware of it, and we're setting up defenses against it. So I view this as actually a good thing, because it was minor, fixed. If we go to full out, decent, real electronic warfare, this should help prepare us. And if it didn't, we're idiots.
Excellent point. So I'd like to start to move to some questions from the audience. So protocol-wise, do you want to be reading it from the chat window, or what's the best method to?
Why don't we open it up
We'll
first?
open it up in here first.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So could you please identify yourself and then ask your question?
Hi, I'm Gentry. I'm a fellow here at the Potomac Institute. How are we prepared because of the Colonial Pipeline? No, I don't see any. I see small incremental steps towards resilience, and that is far from being prepared to sustain a nation state perpetuated attack to compromise our either force readiness or critical functions.
Mike, I think that was partially directed at
I love that question. The safest time I ever traveled on an airplane was 1 month after 9/11. What's happened since? That answers the question. Once a big event like that happens, it's human nature, particularly in this country. Now we're prepared for it. If we're not, like I said, we need to be. The fact we're discussing it means we better be preparing for it. It's already warned us. Be aware this is coming. Expect it to get worse. Build up your defenses.
As society, broadly, we're at least paying more attention, because of events like this. People who, just either didn't care, didn't know about it, there's at least more conversation about these things. There's some things that are happening, right? There are, software supply chain attacks, and there are efforts that are being taken to at least make that a little bit more difficult. So I could not agree more. We are not prepared. And I think we have a long, long way to go. I am at least encouraged by the attention that the topic is getting sort of broadly.
It's just among the general public.
Anybody who works in defense intelligence knows that there's 10 colonial pipelines that happen a day, 20, 50 a day, depending on the day.
So to that end, actually, and to Mike's allusion earlier about regulation and the regulatory side of things, are we seeing indications, aside from just recognizing the problem, that something's actually being done by government? I mean, from your perspective on that front?
Well, I think what you're focusing in on, Gentry, is this is a different situation, right? Nation state threats are a different situation than maybe hackers, right? That are even sponsored by nation state. They're a whole different ballgame. Just because you have a defense against a hacker, a criminal hacker, doesn't mean you have a defense against the determined nation state. Is that part of what?
Not necessarily, especially since the hackers get hand-me-down nation state tools.
So you're not drawing a distinction?
No, not in this case.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah.
No, fair
There
enough.
is a distinction, yes.
Fair enough.
Thanks. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah,
So,
sound good, Catherine? Yeah.
thanks for holding this event. I think it's really important. I'm Taffy Kingscott from IBM. So I listened to your comments very closely, and I too am a Cold War baby, much advanced today. But anyway, I'd like to go back to the comments that you made, Mr. Shaffer, with respect to the investments that other nations are making in the microelectronics industry. And you mentioned $450 billion in Korea and 200 to 200 billion in China and so on. And I think this is a moment that we all need to reflect upon the legislation that's being proposed today in the United States, the CHIPS legislation, the $52 billion that is being proposed. And the fact that it hasn't been enacted yet, hasn't been funded yet, is really something that I believe everybody in the United States should be thinking about, because this is a down payment for what we need. It's not what we need. It's the down payment. And, to a point that somebody made with respect to what can industry do, it's really, I think, critical for us all to understand the voices that are being put forward right now from industry, and not just the semiconductor industry, but also the users, the automobile industry, the medical devices industry, the transportation industry. There's really widespread understanding in industry that this is important, but whatever we all can do to ensure that our policymakers understand this and see that this isn't a tradable item. It shouldn't be a trade-off for something else, but it's a fundamental requirement for the national security and the economic vitality of our nation. So thanks for holding the event. And I don't know if that was a question, but it was heartfelt comment.
It was an emphatic comment. An emphatic comment, Taffy. Thank you.
I agree that it's a down payment. I also agree that with the other economic issues, or maybe I will say with the other economic issues facing America, we've got to think about a different way of structuring the total investment, because we can't match Korea and we can't match China as they're going after just microelectronics. So we have to broaden it with, below prime rate loans with different types of grants. And it's just really, how do we leverage government investment, recognizing the $52 billion is just a down payment?
Absolutely. And the other point that I'll make here quickly is in the legislation that was passed recently, it does include investment tax credit for fabs, but we need to expand that. I agree with you entirely. And we need to think across the whole ecosystem with not just fabs, but also with advanced development and prototyping and packaging, because we don't have any packaging here in the United States today. Yep. It's all done elsewhere. Closest advanced packaging is in Canada. And so to the degree we can all recognize the vulnerabilities we have and do something to address it, I think we're all better off.
Yep. I would just say, the good news to me, again, looking at silver linings here, I agree completely about the importance of that legislation, and very much support it. It in some ways it kind of sort of breaks the seal on what was very difficult in terms of a policy barrier, and people sort of having a reaction to what looks very much like industrial policy, and saying, yeah, but it's important and it's national defense and economic security, and we need to do it anyway. And when I also hope that the focus of that funding, which is still sort of in the air, exactly how it's going to be spent. Some of the most expensive things that we need to do are the leading edge, the next generation technologies. I hope that is the focus of the current legislation. The other things, once you've sort of established that this is important for the country, doing things like legacy technologies, packaging, assembly, these are much smaller investments, and hopefully those will be things that we can start to tackle as well, I hope.
Yeah, industrial policy is always politically fraught, right? Mm-hmm. However, when it comes to be essential, there are areas where we've done that repeatedly in our history, in the history of the United States.
Yeah, it's a wholesome discussion. If all we do with the USICA Act is chase state of the art, my belief is we will have failed.
So one of our virtual participants weighed in on this, asking kind of, is 52 billion really enough? Right, as you made the point, it's a down payment, but they fairly or not make the comparison or pretend that when the 2008 crisis happened, the bailouts were much larger, and $5 trillion in quantitative easing were sent into short finance and housing. I don't know if that's a fair comparison or not, apples and oranges, but is it really that big of a security risk overall that we could see those kinds of numbers at the end of the day being focused in that direction?
I think one quick comment is that money was paid back, right? Majority.
Right.
So yes. You can think of it as an investment. This isn't money that you're burning, you're lighting on fire to buy something. you're making an investment that's supposed to give a return. I mean, not just a financial return, but also for the country, right? Financially and national security wise.
That's actually a good question for Mike to answer because he has the economic standpoint.
Yes, absolutely. Mike, would you like to weigh in on that?
Specifically what part? I didn't hear it. Uh-oh.
Tim?
All right. I lost your sound for a little bit.
Oh, okay. Let's repeat the question so Mike can hear it.
So essentially, the discussion was around this. We got some feedback coming in. All right? Can you hear me? Okay.
Y'all can't talk at the same time.
Okay. No problem. Okay. So the question really is, or the discussion was, we're talking about the $52 billion being a down payment. Essentially, during the financial crisis, up to $5 trillion was spent on quantitative easing because it was really a threat to our existence, arguably, on many levels, right? Economically. So is this comparable? Do you see this as a comparable economic threat? And is that down payment? Where do we see that going? What's enough, I guess?
Well, the key thing I can weigh on is the quantitative easing in the macroeconomics of the economy. We are in one of the most deflationary macroeconomic periods in human history. There's a book called The Price of Tomorrow, written by Jeff Booth, a New York Times bestseller. Right now, this is a blip in that trend. And what the Federal Reserve is doing is counteracting these natural deflationary trends in terms of electronics and production. I'll just give you one simple little technology thing. The average cost of U.S. shale crude oil is $37 a barrel. Right now on the screens, it's $81. That's because of just rapidly advancing technology. But quantitative easing is completely necessary from the Fed to offset this, particularly when we have the economy, stock market declining, and particularly after the U.S., we shut down, every country in the world shut down their economies over COVID. The thing that's most significant about this, when people say that's bad for the U.S., is I like to say, well, which country's better? And when you compare the dollar versus a basket of other countries, the U.S. is still as Churchill would say about democracy, where, it's a poor form of government, except for all the other ones. The U.S. is the best in the space because we have the most enduring economy, the best economic system, and we have high debt to GDP. But the quantitative easing is going to continue to happen. There's one key factor that was mentioned earlier about stock buybacks. Just imagine if the stock market goes down 20% and stays down. That's potentially going to be somewhat of a recession. And there's a reason the stock market needs to stay up. Now, I'm not advocating for that, but that's what quantitative easing does. It helps prevent crashes. And the worst thing we can do for this country is have a depression. What does that do for our economic stability for other countries? So that's part of it. And the key thing I'll leave you with is, as far as quantitative easing, we hear all this talk about taper and Fed raising rates. I still view that as somewhat of a dream, because what's happening is every time we've had a crisis, rates have gone lower, starting with the stock market crash in '87. Now we're at zero. We're at quantitative easing. The economy is doing well, but look at yourselves a year from now. What's this going to look like? We're going to be measured from the bounce is over. It's more organic. It's got to kick in again, and those deflationary forces start to pick back in. These supply chains, rule of pure free markets is people, human ingenuity will overtake it. So I'm very favorable to what the Fed's doing, but I think they're kind of stuck in an area where it really benefits things like Bitcoin, because they know they have to keep this quantitative easing up to offset natural deflationary forces. And a lot of that comes from electronics and rapidly advancing technology.
Thing I have to remark on is that when we are at such low interest rates, right, what are your levers, right? Do you need levers, right? You don't have any lever anymore. All right. I'm just thinking of the Japan experience with a long period of low interest rates, right?
So I started trading Japanese government bonds in 1995, called JGBs. And everybody I talked to said, we're short and we're happy. That's when yields are around 4 or 5%. And now they're negative. That's where the U.S. is probably going. I don't see what stops it. and it's going to piggyback on the next correction in the stock market. And that's why it's so important. It's all trickle down and up to the stock market. It's the most expensive in history versus GDP. I agree with you. What are your next bullets? But don't underestimate the bullets of the ability of the Federal Reserve to pump money into the system when they need to. And but it's more the free markets that matter. And it's part of the reason I think interest rates in this country are going to stay at zero and go negative in terms of bonds. And it's not profound. It's just Japan started, Europe followed, and here we are.
Because I think you have to have some gray hair to remember a major inflationary period. Because I do. I remember when interest rates were over 10% to buy a house, right? But that's been a long time. It's been a long time, right? Since we've had an inflationary period. That's fascinating from the economic history perspective.
So I'll give you one fact. I'll give you one fact on that. Total liquid fuel consumption.
Sorry, I think Mike had one more comment.
Yeah, so just one fact on that. Total liquid fuel consumption in this country is about 20 million barrels a day. That's the same as it was 20 years ago. That's never happened in the history of modern mankind, that we use the same amount of liquid fuel despite the economy blasting off. What is that? Efficiency and demographic shifts. And the whole world's going EVs. What did the U.S. help start? Tesla. It's just a matter of time that consumption goes down, yet our production is going up. Those are deflationary forces. That's the strength of the U.S. economy that's crushing China. That's why we have to make sure, from an economic standpoint, just don't mess it up.
We want, sir.
I had a few comments about security. I remember in 1974 at the Army War College, before you were born, but we had a distinguished speaker.
I was born before 1974, okay. Sir.
We had a very distinguished speaker who talked about security. And being a Marine, I was his escort because we Marines were not considered smart enough to ask questions. And so I asked him privately, I said, how do you define security? And he said, security is to survive as a nation and perchance flourish. And, you know, that is something to think about. We don't want to go overboard on all these topics. We got to have a balanced approach, I think. I also think that, and I've mentioned this to Al before, this is an international warfare issue, and it's an international information warfare issue, and they ought to be combined and work it from that angle. The question I have for the panel is, does China or Russia have a supply chain problem? And if so, why don't we think about how we cope with that?
Well, sir, an immediate reaction I want to have to hear from the panelists too is that they're still absolutely dependent on the West for their electronic chip supply. That's a fact. That's just a fact. And they're absolutely dependent on the West for fab tools. They don't have a fab tool business to build a fab.
I mean, you talked about the Cold War and your experiences and that kind of thing. Back when the former Soviet Union faced their challenges near the end, the big thing is, of course, they tried to be a capitalist country with a socialist leadership, and it didn't work. And when they did that and threw themselves open, that's when they really became vulnerable across the board. But at the end, and for example, in 1991, 1992, when we went over there to try to help them, I mean, they were nearly helpless in terms of economics and everything else. They didn't know anything, and so there was vulnerabilities. They must be much better now, I'm sure. But I just think that these countries they have their share of challenges and vulnerabilities too, and we don't spend enough time really thinking about that.
Yeah. Well, so I've made a few quick remarks, but I want to hear from the panelists about what they think about the general's question. So anyone want to weigh in? Otherwise I can keep talking. If you don't say something, I'll keep talking.
I'm happy to.
We'll turn it over to Mike, but Jay had something to say.
Just a couple of thoughts. It is certainly true that they don't have a comprehensive supply chain plan. It is also true that they're trying hard to remedy that. It's going to be a very, very long and difficult road. But to the extent that competitiveness is impacted. Some of the things that I see that are happening today in China that I think we need to be paying attention to. One is significant investment in legacy technology, which is going to drive prices down. It's going to undercut markets, and it's going to undercut any new Western investments in older technology, older silicon technology. So growing at older nodes to meet today's supply chain problems is going to, I think, be really challenging economically for those investments in the future. And the other, Mike, earlier you mentioned being worried about design, and I think within the last 2 weeks, Alibaba announced a cloud scale processor that is reported to be as good as anything else that's out there. It's highly competitive, and so when you start thinking about premiums for security and things like that, just keeping in mind, which I think security is a thing that we must do and work on together. But just keep in mind that the price pressures and the global competitiveness pressures are going to be coming from perhaps places that aren't investing in those same protections. So being worried about sort of being undercut both from a fabrication and manufacturing perspective as well as a design perspective is something to factor in.
Yeah, I just want to pop with that. We're talking about making major investments for the country in this space. We're talking about fabs often and testing. We're not often thinking about design and how do we stimulate the fabless industry, because it's been a pillar of strength for the U.S. Our Qualcomm, and actually even I would say Microsoft is big in this too, but their own processors that they're building. The fabless industry is very important, and how do we keep it healthy and growing and powerful? It's just as important as building fabs, if not more, I would say. But so, Mike, I want you to get a chance to weigh in on the General's remarks.
Thank you, General Gray. As a son and a father of our U.S. Marines, I'm definitely a wannabe, and I always wanted to. So I want to help serve my country. So the key fact to remember about China is they can't feed themselves, and they do not have enough energy at all. They have to import both. And who is a good place to import energy, or obviously Saudi Arabia, but what does Russia have? Plenty of energy, which is being replaced by technology, and they're economically insignificant. Nothing economically on a scale like compared to the U.S. or even, let's say, the UK. So to me, that's why I like to point out is we are ahead of the world and accelerating in terms of economics. And that's why I hear these debates, great debates in Congress. They're wonderful because it's open discourse versus what just happened in China. President Xi said, no cryptos for you. This to me is what we need to make sure we keep up, and what Mr. Shaffer said about incentivizing with proper systems, because trying to have the government do it doesn't work. That's what Soviet Union did. It failed. That's what China's doing. It's failing, and I'm showing many reasons why it's failing. And so why is U.S. shale crushing the world? Why did OPEC now used to be exporting maybe 30% of the world's oil? Now they're down at 20%. In 10 years, they're going to be insignificant. We're all begin driving EVs. I drive an electric car. It's awesome. I drive a poor man's Tesla, Chevy Volt, and I have solar panels. It's all just technology. That's why it's so important for the U.S. to embrace it, adopt it, not fall behind. And what's happening in China right now is they're falling behind in cryptos, and the whole world's going digital.
I'm definitely hearing that the potential adversaries or real adversaries have their own supply chain issues that we certainly need to be aware of and think about when we strategize. So this has been a great conversation,
Mike,
on their challenges. So Al,
if I could, I'd like to react to General Gray, because I think number one, something you said, sir, is exactly right. We have to think about this as an international issue with our friends and allies. Second, and this is something we talked about in a previous session, I don't think we have a national strategy right now for how to deal with competition. I think China has a strategy, and Chairman Xi has his 14th five-year plan that, when you look at it, is a very clear roadmap of what China believes they need to do strategically. And if we looked at what they did militarily over the last 30 years, they did not try to take U.S. head on. They tried to just develop the weapon systems that would disrupt our maritime engagement, would roll us back beyond the second island chain. And I think there's a real nugget in there. So I'm going to look at Tim. One of the things we have done to date is approach this problem as an issue versus issue. What we haven't done is said, where are the inherent vulnerabilities of potential adversaries? So a session that would say, where, instead of taking China on head where they're strongest, where do we loop back around and say, where are vulnerabilities that can be exploited? And Mike hit them, energy and other places. But as far as supply chain, China does have a very clear plan of what they want to do to start to close that gap. And they're investing in the number of new fabs that they're putting up dramatically outpaces what we have. They are not state of the art, with one exception, but at least they have a plan to how they're going to compete over the long term. And I don't think we're there.
That's right. I mean, first of all, they're long-term planners. For them, 50 years or even 100 years is nothing. And we can't plan past 2 or 3 years without getting all mixed up about everything.
That's a lot of quarters.
That's exactly right. Secondly, they have their own vulnerabilities, quite a few. They have people problems. They have all kinds of challenges. And we ought to clearly understand that. And we ought to clearly have a plan internationally to at least balance that out or cope with it as appropriate. We have, in my humble opinion, our national strategy is wrong. We're paying way too much attention to war with China. That's ridiculous. We don't want to go to war with China, and they don't want to go to war with us. And that has big challenges in terms of globalization and everything else like that. You do something against China, it affects Africa, it affects Latin America. There's all kinds of international challenges here that we need to understand more about. Why would the Chinese want to go to war with us? And why should we want to go to war with them? So I think that's, grossly overstated right now. But then, of course, nobody listens to me anyway, so we don't have to worry about it. But that's my view.
So I'd like to add one thing to what Mike said before about China's challenges with energy and food. Also, another one, and I knew this because I had the good fortune to visit China a few times, is the graying of the population, right? They have their own issue, which is severe and getting worse, right? About how are they going to support their future generations with an increasing percentage of older people with their one child law. The impact of that is significant. We shouldn't underestimate that.
One thing I like to add is this is an economic war, whether you call it or not. And there's one very simple solution to absolutely crush the Chinese Communist Party, not China, the Communist Party, and that is accept, adopt, and with properly regulate digital assets. Now, here's the thing, like I mentioned earlier, just imagine the animosity you get for 1.3 billion people when they're prevented from being part of this modern economy and prevented from diversifying what little wealth they have in the world's best performing assets and being part of the new world. That's what's happening right now. China just basically threw themselves down on the wrestling mat and said, pin us. And the U.S. has taken slow, nice approach. Just here's a simple thing I like to leave with. Mr. Gensler just came in as head of SEC, and a few months ago, the U.S. just approved Bitcoin ETFs. This is a major issue for Chinese. They're being pushed away from the best performing asset on the planet. It's just that my thing I remember when I was young and living in Europe and reading the International Herald Tribune, and one of the guys who said when he was in the Soviet Union says, we knew what we were missing when I got a bootleg cassette tape of Led Zeppelin and Jimi Hendrix.
Maybe in that order. If I could, very quick, because I think this is very important. Coming back around to what both General Gray said and Mike said, I remember being in a very senior group in the Pentagon where we were reviewing war games, and some of the U.S. 2 and 3 stars were talking about actions against China that would have threatened the party. Two of the 4 stars in the room, myself, said that is not something we want to do. We don't want to threaten the party because that's the one thing that would cause China to go kinetic. So that comes back around to what is the strategy? And we don't want to destroy the Chinese economy. We just don't want to have them putting our people at a disadvantage. And that's part of the whole competitive thing.
So can I ask a follow-up to that? You having spent so much time in the building over there, understanding that culture and organization, and this is something that we're trying to do, is elevate these kinds of issues so national security professionals understand what they are, and so you can change that view, that a new approach, right, a different way of, and I think Mike made a great allusion to this too, in outlining his vulnerabilities, as you said. Is that even possible though, to have the building think about conflict in those terms? And if so, how do we get there from where we're at? We're so focused on widgets, right? On kinetic effects, and we don't think about competition, those terms from the building. So how is that something? First of all, is it in their lane, and second of all, is it something that we could actually have DoD change to?
So I think it has to be in their lane. I came up in SAC, Strategic Air Command. And what was the motto of SAC? Do you remember?
Always prepared. No?
Peace is our profession.
Peace.
The goal of any military person should be to avoid armed conflict. You have to be ready to go for it, but it's to avoid armed conflict. And that discussion has to be held in the Pentagon. How do we prevent kinetic exchange, or now in the modern world, the non-kinetic strategic war with China? And you don't increase that probability by threatening the party.
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, if you look back at Chinese history, their whole history in terms of leadership and thought processes is the indirect approach. They never have advertised the direct approach. That's what Sun Tzu is all about. That's the big difference between them and Clausewitz and all that. I mean, it's ridiculous. And no, you're right on.
But so we'll take one more question inside. I think Tim had a question, then we'll move on to some of the online questions. So Tim.
That is Tim Bumpus over here, one of our colleagues.
Yeah, hi, great discussion. So I want to circle back a little bit to the discussion of learning lessons and what it means to actually learn the lesson. I think there are a lot of people who'd say we understood that there was vulnerabilities from a global pandemic. And certainly if you asked anybody who was in public health or an adjacent field when all of this started, they were going to tell you it was a big deal. But we had SARS, we had MERS, we had H1N1, we had Ebola. So understanding it is clearly not learning the lesson. So what is the lesson that we need to learn here? And what does actually learning the lesson do? What is the end state that we need to arrive at to have learned?
If someone on the panel want to take that, because the thread is I'll talk unless someone from the panel talks.
I'll just make one comment. To me, if I am thinking about this from a long-term strategic perspective, what is the thing that we need the most? It is robustness and resiliency. And to me, that is having a diversity of options, a diversity of suppliers, leveraging, the entire industry when we need to. And so making sure, again, that we're doing everything we can to eliminate single points of failure and making the entire industry more secure.
All right. Well, thank you, Jay. Mike, would you like to weigh in on this?
Not for me on that one.
Okay. Online, we'll move to take some more questions online.
Yeah. So one of the things that we've tried to do with this program is from early on is to make sure that we're getting all generations perspectives, particularly our younger colleagues at the institute, but just broader, because guess what? They're gonna have to live with the decisions that are made today. So with that said, I'd like to ask a question from one of our interns, and the question is, as we talk about sustainable markets and the shift of the sorry, this thing just jumped. Hold on a second, let me get back to it.
Can you just ready to unmute it?
Oh, is she on?
She can
Okay,
ask
great.
directly. That's even better.
Great.
That's even better.
Hi, my name is Sameen. I was a former intern and I now work as a software engineer at a autonomous vehicle company. So my question is, as we were talking about sustainable markets and the shift of the field from defense to commercially driven, I think a lot about the consumer-led pushes for companies to detangle their supply chain from Asian countries that have largely failed. So for example, thinking about privacy and labor condition concerns. So how can we learn and apply this consumer-driven momentum towards a more national security-driven supply chain change? And are we willing to mimic the conditions, economic or otherwise, in Asia that have made them so sticky for US companies? Thank you.
That sounds like a heavily economics question. So I'm thinking about Jay and Mike here on this.
I was going to say you go, Jay, because it's a little bit microeconomic for me. I'm more macro.
Just the first thing that does come to mind. I mean, that's a very good question. It highlights how difficult it is to move supply chains around. It is a very complex industry. I think broadly, many companies have been working diligently over the last couple of years to try to diversify their supply chains, and in many cases that means away from China and having other options. And in many cases, they've failed to do it so far. To your point, so I think it does just highlight how challenging that can be. Do we want to mimic how they got there? Probably not. But there are some things, to Al's earlier point, that are probably necessary, which is government support of strategic, certain strategic investments.
So, Mike, did you have something to add?
I'll give a macro on that. Why was the U.S. completely energy and independent? Because of what happened in the 70s. Poof, trade's done. Free markets took over. I'm hoping it happens in this case just more rapidly. So that's, to me, my macro stance. I guess it's obviously I'm a hopeless optimist, but the fact we've had this issue, we're discussing it, we all know there's a supply chain issue, means that let's incentivize free markets to alleviate. So I think a year from now, we're going to be less worried about this. But that's just what I've seen in broad commodities. Like I said, I used to own a farm, and 40% of that crop goes ethanol. That was in the 70s. That was a problem. It didn't happen.
Thank you. Yeah, especially as we're talking about subsidies and these numbers, I think about some of the issues that might not be as easy to solve just by throwing money, like, for example, labor or even talent pool and things like that. So, yeah, thank you so much.
Comment?
I think I would just try to expand it. And Tim, this is one of the really hard problems you have. We tend to linearize a very complex problem. And when we think about supply chain, one thing I don't think, and I haven't heard us talk about today, is risk and a risk assessment. So I believe our intelligence function spends way too much time thinking about platforms and not enough time thinking about what is the inherent potential vulnerability of using, pick your country, Chinese, Korean, Taiwan chips in 5G and 6G. Is there a vulnerability? And you don't see that type of assessment other than hair on fire. Oh my God, it's 5G. We can't let China have 5G. Why? And we have not yet matured to the point where we understand how to analyze the threat and the vulnerability. So we can't do a risk-based assessment. Until you can do a risk-based assessment, it's hard to really unravel the supply chain to know whether or not you have to do something.
To that point, I think that's a great point. Do we have something to learn from the world that Mike McGlone lives in, right? Does DoD have something to learn from the risk analysis, from the market analysis that is transferable to what we perceive as national security threats? And is that even something? Is that a conversation that's even happening, right, between the building and your world? And if not, how come? I mean, that is, that's huge to us being able to make sure that we maintain some kind of competitive advantage given what we're seeing. Mike, are you aware of those kinds of conversations?
I'd love to comment. I mean, what really happened in a lot of the wars in the past? I mean, the real wars, the best way to really hurt your enemy is to base their currency. Start there. They can't buy weapons and things and pay their troops and feed their troops, and that's traditional war. Now we're focusing on the newer modern war, and I'm seeing the Cold War happening. I'm not pointing out so much what we should be doing, but what's happening, and it is just something not to mess up. It's happening. The U.S. dollar is gaining dominance. Despite what people hear, it's we're going to be replaced by gold or China. It's the complete opposite by doing nothing. And so to me, that's my point about a lot of this. It's these known knowns are the most important. For me as a markets guy, I'm more concerned about the unknown knowns. Like supply chain, that's a known known. We're going to cover it. We're talking about it. We're dealing with it. The best way to really kick it in is what Al said earlier. Incentivize industry. And the best way to incentivize industry is the old tax man. Give people tax incentives. Why am I in Miami? Because the low tax state and the whole world's going there. So to me, that's the way it is. But it's the economic part of it that's most important in this new world. As Coolidge said, the business is business, but it's just going so digital and virtual. And that's my point is, we're just not mess it up. U.S. just keep the proper regulation coming. And that's why am I so bearish on commodities? Because we create too much of it at lower cost. That wasn't the case in 20 years ago. And why am I so bullish on crypto assets? Because they're revolutionizing the world. Like this, you might have heard of this thing called Ethereum. There is crypto dollars. There's a dozen crypto dollar tokens. They all trade on Ethereum token. And guess what? China can't do that.
Yeah, fascinating. So I believe there was another question from this side of the house.
Yeah. Hi, Gentry Lane again, from the Potomac Institute. An idea of competition advantage as a commodity,
sort of, I think, is what you're saying. And I'd like to hear from the whole panel. If we have the expertise, we have the national resources, we have the energy, land, water that you need to be standing up fabs and packagers. We have the workforce, and there is capital, both in private and public sources. What's the problem? Why are we not standing up? Why is there not a new fab going up every month? I know they take like 5 years to set up, and how many millions of dollars? It can't be that expensive.
I can start with that one because we've thought about that a lot at the think tank and with all the people that we engage with. I mean, a big factor is subsidies, to be quite frank, right? If you're talking about making a business and you're talking about this global business, which semiconductors are, there's a substantial, subsidies that most countries do, like Korea and Taiwan and things like that. So if you want to get in and build a new fab, it costs you substantially more. And it isn't the workforce. Labor is not the primary factor. It's actually fascinating when you peel the onion on this. The biggest one that we've come up with from analyzing this is subsidies. Other countries see this in their national interest and they're prepared to invest. And we talked before about industrial policy as an anathema politically. It's a hot potato in the United States. You have to really sell it strongly. I think to me, that's the biggest one, but I don't know if other panelists have another perspective.
I very much agree. I would say, even the second most significant factor, I believe, economically, is something that's not advantageous to us. So it's subsidies. If you think about a fab, just to start with, and make lots of assumptions, but a new one might be on the order of $15 billion. And again, you can hear different numbers, but on the order of maybe 30 to 40% penalty for doing that in the U.S. versus a place like Taiwan. So that's why we're not doing it all the time. Where does that come from? The biggest component is subsidies. And probably the second biggest is the amount of time that it takes to start a project and put it into actual manufacturing, because you have billions of dollars of equipment just sitting there idle, not making money. And so, we're not particularly good at going fast.
There's a lot of licensing and regulation hurdles we have to jump, right?
That's right. Do we have the workforce? Not sure who has the workforce at this point, because we say we don't. Taiwan says they're running out of engineers too. But debatable whether we could build a couple new fabs a year and staff them. So that is something that we certainly need to do from a workforce and education perspective. Strongly agree with that. So just a few challenges that I think we faced, but I think again, I am encouraged by this, the conversation and some of the legislation that's starting to.
But we're at a disadvantage. It's a great question, because we are at a fundamental disadvantage compared to the rest of the world in this area.
There's also just momentum. It is more cost effective and efficient to just keep doing things in the same place. The fact that all of TSMC's engineers are on the island of Taiwan, and perhaps they have to, make people go to work an hour away, in one set of fabs to another is sort of a big investment they might have to make. So if you think about taking, the hundreds of engineers that it would take to bring up one of these new facilities and say, okay, take, 400 of your best engineers and move them to, Arizona or wherever that may be. It's just a lot harder. It's a bigger investment to actually sort of break that flywheel of just building more where you are. So the fact that we're maybe starting to get some of that, investment here is encouraging, but I think we need to make sure that we sort of capitalize on that momentum.
I would say also add that getting the supporting trades is difficult. If you're doing this in a different geography, and we hear this from people in the DC area, like from Micron in DC, just getting the tradespeople to do the HVAC and the plumbing and electricity that's necessary for a fab is really hard when you're doing it in an area that doesn't have a lot of other fabs. It's really hard.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't want to give short shrift to the online questions. We have some time left, so let's hit a few more of these online.
Yeah, I've got a softball one for you, Mike, here, and this is a shameless plug for the Institute. How does a Potomac Institute intersect or not with the Defense Microelectronics cross-functional team? Similar study that's going on.
You're peddling a softball like that, right?
It's an easy one to hit on.
Yeah. Well, we've been working on microelectronics policy pretty much since near the inception of the organization. And so we're a known quantity in this space. We have lots of very experienced people thinking about this problem. And so senior efforts like the cross-functional team come to us for advice, and we're currently actively supporting that effort to develop a access strategy, right, for the Secretary of Defense for microelectronics. So this is the new organization that was stood up almost a year ago to develop a access strategy, and we're heavily engaged in that area, as we are with other customers. We're primarily in this space. The Defense Department has been our primary sponsor, but we're realizing more and more that it's the economic drivers that matter for the success of even the defense enterprise. So that was a shameless softball. So. And how about a hardball question for somebody?
Well, to that end, there's a question just straightforward, and this is to Mike McGlone. I would say just from our discussion today so far, what really is that connection between microelectronics, cryptocurrency, and hacking? Where do we focus from the discussion today with regard to vulnerability and resiliency as we've been talking about?
Well, let's start with the last part of that. As far as hacking, it's the payment mechanism. Cryptocurrency is often used. Bitcoin's the worst one. The feds love it. You can track it. You have to use some kind of privacy coin. That's where proper regulation should come into the space. And this is just the cyber warfare. This is just warfare accelerating to the cyberpunks. And the U.S. has the complete lead in that space. I mean, it's just not as centralized, I think. Okay, of course, there's North Korea, but there's not much. You have to use whips to get people to do things there. Now, as far as crypto assets, the microelectronics are a little less. It's less my space, but to me, the key thing that the fact is in crypto assets, I think we're going to look back at 2021 from the future and say, yeah, that was a defining moment that marked the peak of the Chinese Communist Party. And all the U.S. has to do is do nothing, because they ban this. It's like banning the internet. They did try that. They banned Winnie the Pooh. They banned the NBA. I mean, come on, we see what's going on here. It's, back to the Ming Dynasty. It's closing in. And it's just, I'm not saying the U.S. should throw them on the mat, but U.S. needs to continue to do what we're doing, and that's just adopt free market capitalism, provide incentive where we need help, like you mentioned, supply chain, mostly tax. Don't write tax. Provide incentive. Let free markets reign. I mean, why is Singapore so wonderful? Why was Hong Kong so wonderful? Because they were low tax states. It all comes down to the tax. But so to me, that's the key thing. Crypto assets are a thing. I'll leave you with this. With crypto dollars, you can transact US dollars 24/7 instantly for virtually nothing and earn interest well above euro dollars. You can't do that in any other asset on the planet. The U.S. just needs to regulate, and that's where we're going. As long as we regulate properly and provide incentive for it to continue, for businesses to accelerate using the dollar, and that doesn't mean disincentivize them to use any other currency. It's just the dollar's been adopted globally, organically in crypto assets, and the U.S. should say, okay, thank you. Let's make sure we make that on-ramp happen like we did with the internet.
What's that? Yeah, we'll do one more question, and then
go ahead. Yeah.
Unless there was any responses.
No, that's good.
One theme that we continue to see, I think, again, if I may, is that DoD is not necessarily really paying attention to this as a priority. And when I say this, I mean the economic aspect of things, right? We're still enamored, and I know we're talking about this, but it seems to be a repeating theme. Enamored with focusing on ships and planes and tanks, and rather than some of the other capabilities, right, that can help us, be successful moving forward. So I have one more online question here, because we haven't, and this is a kind of a change in pace here. So I'm hoping that we get some thoughts on this. But thoughts on microelectronic shortages in the space sector. It seems we don't have the proper infrastructure, both in testing and manufacturing, to keep up with commercial and national security demand on the space front. What are the key factors blocking government investment in these areas, and why does executive branch and legislative branch leaders not prioritize? So any thoughts on the space sector specifically in this realm, or is that for a future?
I have some things I can say, but unless there's another panelist who's kind of, because we have been following the space community. I would say space has been the purview of government for decades, right? It's been a specialty area that hasn't really been commercial until recent years, right? So we've been very conservative because it's expensive to send big satellites into space. So we've tested the crap out of the stuff that we generate. So that's very important. Now there's been a revolution in commercial space, and we have a whole center that's looking at the implications of that here at the think tank. That's changing things. Now they may not have the same harsh environments that the defense, needs to operate under. However, they still need testing capabilities. And this is something that's been primarily the sole purview of the government. All the different radiation that in the community that I speak with, the radiation hard testing capabilities and facilities, some of them are aging. Some of them are going offline. So that is a challenge perhaps for another day. How does the commercial world benefit from some of the previous investments the government has made in specialized test facilities? And what do they really need going forward? That is a broad question that will take us way beyond the few moments that we have left. My only comment is the commercial world now is a big player in space, and they need to be communicating very well with what the government has invested in for years when it comes to test capabilities, because they're highly specialized. So sorry for that long-winded answer.
So I don't think we have sufficient test capacities, right, hard, but I also don't know where the threat or where the problem is. About a week ago-ish or so, we had a massive coronal mass ejection on the sun. Mm-hmm. It was really, really massive. I have not heard of any commercial satellites being brought down because of that. If that is the case, perhaps We're doing things in design where we don't need to worry about the same level of radiation hardness. I don't know. I think someone has to do the analysis. But if you have a major CME that causes aurora halfway across the US, and we don't lose a satellite, a commercial satellite that's not hardened, someone has to do the analysis of that.
Yeah, there's a different environment, and we don't have the time to go into all the details, but clearly a strategic environment, right, is very different, has different aspects to it than a commercial environment. And are our test facilities sufficient for commercial needs, given all the clever design that we're doing?
Right.
Perhaps.
Yeah,
That's an important question.
and that's something we just have to analyze.
Yeah.
So, Mike, for wrap up, I was wondering if we could just offer everyone just just takeaway. What's the big takeaway?
Yeah.
If we can,
I think we should go through our panelists. So, what do they think the most important takeaway or two is from their own perspectives from this seminar? So maybe I'll look over. We'll start with Al.
Thanks. So I have two takeaways. One, I got to go home and research a little bit more the international Bitcoin and cryptocurrency market, because that actually is very interesting. It's something I don't know that much about. My other takeaway is, there are a lot of problems in the United States. And since I grew up in the military, part of my job is to point out where we have vulnerabilities. But we haven't spoken enough about potential vulnerabilities of other countries. And then my final takeaway is we have not solved the microelectronics problem such that we are not leaving our nation vulnerable to, at the very least, economic blackmail, because we use so much more microelectronics than we produce. And that's a vulnerability just in terms of capacity.
So, Jay.
Yeah, three quick things come to mind. One, just repeat Al's comment. Mike's discussion about cryptocurrency was fascinating. So I really enjoyed that. Second, just related to the last question about space, I'll just leave the group with a question that crossed my mind that I think might be an interesting topic for another day, which is if we went back and looked at potentially maybe not mistakes that were made, but opportunities that were missed when sort of government and defense, decoupling from commercial semiconductors happened a few decades ago. Should we be looking at those lessons when it comes to space today? And will we be looking back on that time that, remember when, the defense really owned space? We invented that technology, now we, so maybe there's an interesting discussion there for sort of long-term commercial space. And the third thing, just with respect to supply chains, is, just thinking about, I'll leave maybe the discussion with some optimism, but also a caution of that things take time. I think good momentum in a lot of these vectors in terms of, engagement between government and industry, people taking security more seriously, across, sort of up and down, even commercial supply chains, but in sort of the hardware space and in an industry where investments are billions of dollars, take lots of planning and resources and things like that. These things aren't super fast. And I think sometimes people have sort of mismatched expectations of, what you can do, with the next chip I buy, which was a project that started 4 or 5 years ago. So, I think good things are happening, but it will take time.
I appreciate that, Jay. So, Mike, I'd like to emphasize.
I'll finish with what you said, Dr. Fritze, and that's economics prevailed the Soviet Union, and that's what's happening now with China, with commodities and cryptocurrencies, and that's from a complete unbiased opinion. If someone sits in front of the terminal, and my job is to get it right for terminal producers, just let's not mess this up, and let's maybe accelerate a little bit. Prevent armed conflict by winning economically with good open free markets that provide incentive for people to mature and to do well in life. That's basically what's happening here. And in terms of cryptos, again, I fully expect by this time next year, we're going to say U.S. is become the crypto center capital of the world. And it already has, basically. We'll just not mess it up.
That, Mike, and I do like a little optimism put in there. Yes, we do have issues we need to face, but we have a lot in our quiver, and this is one of the things we have in our quiver. I'd like to just take a quick opportunity to repeat a few things that came out to me from this discussion, a couple of fundamental points. One is that I think Al Shaffer started this with the new market opportunity that secure electronics may present. I think that's something worth thinking and something that the government can help drive. I also heard, and I believe Mike mentioned this, but maybe several other people did as well. I heard about the power of incentives versus grants. Just giving someone money and walking away, unless you do it perhaps to a university professor, but if you give a company money and walk away, it's probably suboptimal. So incentivizing them to do the right thing, perhaps through even a public-private partnership or tax incentives or other things, is far more effective than just giving out a grant and leaving. That's one thing that I heard. And lastly, I'd like to foot stomp something that's a personal factor for me. And that's, I understand the importance of security and trust, but without guaranteed access to what we need, to critical supply chain elements, we're badly hurt. And so the first thing we always need to discuss and put into place is guaranteed access. And that can involve allies as well. So those are all themes that I heard coming out of this. So Tim, any other final closing remarks?
I just want to say thank you very much to the panel, to our participants today for showing up and having a great discussion. And I think that I gained something from it. I hope everyone else did too. Mike, I really appreciate you coming in from Miami and the perspective that you've provided, because it's not one we hear every day in these circles, and actually with the optimism, I think that's fantastic, especially here in DC. So thank you. I also want to thank the staff who helped us make this a success. Catherine, John, Alex, Mike. So really appreciate it. I hope you'll join us next month. We're planning on doing our next event focused on the role of strategic communications, narratives, and the use of information in the globally competitive environment. And that's we're targeting December 1st for that event. So once again, thank you so much. Thanks again to our panelists, and really appreciate the time today.
Thanks for having me.